Censorship practices in American high school libraries. I chose to research this topic because it is a timely issue for educators and students during a time of increasing political correctness and limited choice of educational content. Considering the strong reading and writing skills are absent among many students, educators taking an active role in promoting access to information in schools is imperative. I prepared a list to begin this presentation of the most frequently banned books in high schools in the United States. I invite you to consider what an English education would consist of without many of these titles. Clearly, the Bible is not typically part of a public school education reading list, but it has been banned in school libraries, limiting a student's access to it if they wanted to read it. In 1981, Nicolai found that students have a constitutional right to access to information. This list is not comprehensive, but it does provide an example of how great the impact of censorship is on reading in schools. Many of the books on the list, including The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn and Fahrenheit 451, belong to an elite group of American literature known as the Western Canon. Books distinguished enough to be included in the canon have shaped generations of Americans and contributed to the rich literary culture of our country. Classic works often discuss important moral and social themes which are vital to the education of young adults, but books in the canon are among the most frequently banned and challenged in high school libraries. Fellow author and Concord Public Library Committee member Louisa May Alcott took action to ban Mark Twain's Huck Finn over 130 years ago. Twain, in a letter to his nephew and publisher, wrote the following on the matter. The committee of the Public Library of Concord, Mass. Have given us a rattling tip-top puff which will go into every paper in the country. They have expelled Huck Finn from their library as trash and suitable only for the slums. That will sell us 25,000 copies, sure. Every year, in fact, 200,000 copies of Huck Finn are sold today, speaking to the timelessness and importance of what is considered to be Twain's greatest work. The pivotal impact of literature on young adults is that it allows them to vicariously examine significant issues in their own lives. A review about censorship would be remiss without discussing the most poignant novel on the impact of control over ideas in books, Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury. Since its publication in 1953, it has sold over 10 million copies, but remains subject to censorship challenges. Since 1990, there have been over 7,000 cases of censorship in schools. Over 50% of challenges result in the limiting of access to information. In 2010, Hill reported that 70% of librarians would not purchase a book for their library based on a possible reaction from parents. Good relationships with parents are imperative for teachers and librarians if we are to encourage reading and intellectual freedom. Censorship is blocking or limiting access to information. It occurs when books, movies, magazines, art, newspapers, television programs, and the internet are restricted, redacted, or removed. For the purpose of narrowing the research, this review looked at the restriction and removal of books from high school libraries. There are three types of censorship that are important to understand and differentiate between. The first is censorship which stems from a challenge, a written or oral complaint about the content of a book. Most of these complaints emerge from a belief that certain words or topics in books are inappropriate for young adults. In 1983, a sociologist named W. Phillips Davison explained the urge individuals have to prevent others from being exposed to messages that might influence their opinions or behaviors. His hypothesis, the third-person effect, or TPE, stated that people overestimate the influence communications have on the attitudes and behaviors of others. According to Davison, people expect communications to have a greater effect on others than themselves, and the communication will lead others to take some action. Davison's hypothesis explained why people feel the need to prevent young minds from being exposed to books that send perceived messages of immorality or contain profanity or sexuality. In 2008, Gorlewski found that students have the capacity to understand words in the context intended by the author and can evaluate potentially offensive language without being influenced or upset by it. A second type of censorship, known as bowdlerization, is redacting words or entire sections of books. This kind of censorship, while intended to limit the exposure of others to profanity, serves only to inhibit the artistic expression of authors and violates their First Amendment right of free expression. The third and most common type of censorship is self-censorship. It is a pervasive issue in libraries due to the unethical nature of restricting free access to information. Libraries often practice self-censorship in their collection development by failing to acquire books that are frequently challenged or banned. Challenges are time-consuming and expensive, so libraries purchase books that have not been subjects of challenges. The irony is that there are so many reasons used in challenges, virtually any book could end up facing a challenge. The American Library Association, or ALA, strongly discourages libraries from practicing self-censorship or holding books in restricted areas. The ALA recommends that libraries use democratic selection methods and have written selection and challenge policies, but only 15% of libraries have both. The ALA and researchers maintain that libraries must hold a position in defending intellectual and academic freedom, access to information, and the mission of every library, to provide free and varied information to all. In separate 2010 studies, Hill and Duthie support the ALA in recommending that these proactive measures be used in libraries. Building good relationships with parents has often been the strongest barrier in avoiding challenges. Of the high-profile First Amendment court cases in the 20th century, there are 3 that have had a lasting and considerable effect on students' rights. The 1969 Tinker v. Des Moines case was the result of students wearing black armbands to school to protest the war in Vietnam. The Supreme Court determined that students had a right to wear the armbands as long as their doing so did not disrupt the educational activities of the school. The relevance of the case to censorship is the emergence of what is known as the Tinker Standard, which has been applied in school library censorship challenges to determine whether or not a book contributes to a disruption on school grounds. The Right to Read Defense Committee case of 1978 was brought before a judge after a poetry anthology called Male and Female Under 18 was challenged because of a poem, City to a Young Girl, written by a 15-year-old high school student. The committee chairman of the school made the determination that the anthology should be removed for containing city because of the language used in the poem. The decision in this case was that the banning of the anthology was an attempt to control students based on personal values, and thus was without justification. The content in question did not interfere with the educational process, but the removal of the anthology violated the First Amendment right to read for students. A 1982 case, Board of Education v. Pico, developed after 11 books, including Slaughterhouse-Five, were banned from school libraries in a New York school district. The decision in this case had a profound impact on the constitutionally protected rights of students. The result was a recognized right for students to receive information representative of all available viewpoints. School officials, under the law, may not suppress information merely because they disagree with it. The research makes 3 things clear. Anyone can find a reason to ban or challenge a book. Reasons cited in book bannings or complaints include profanity, sex, religion, witchcraft, violence, horror, rebellion, racism, sexism, substance use, suicide, death, and depressing or negative tones. But none of these reasons can justify censorship. Schools have the responsibility to educate informed students who possess basic literacy skills, and the availability of a wide variety of reading materials is paramount. While schools do not have the right to remove books from their libraries unless they disrupt the educational process, parents can and should make decisions about what their own children read. In 2015, the National Council for Teachers of English found that only around 7% of all characters in young adult books belong to minority groups. There is a special issue of the banning of work by minority authors that has only received attention in a few studies. With respect to a representation of the values of all communities, this is an area that deserves more attention to create a truly inclusive educational landscape. Though legislation has been passed for the control of content on the internet for minors, implications of this practice with regard to students are unknown at this time. Librarians and teachers should help parents make informed choices about reading material. When this occurs, the fear and likelihood of challenges diminishes. More research is needed on how teachers and librarians can actively foster good relationships with parents in order to make sound, collective decisions about literature. In 1998, a researcher named Person found that teachers and librarians see themselves as upholders of traditional democratic principles, especially the tenets of First Amendment rights. In order to defend books intelligently, we must read them in order to provide parents with the information that demonstrates pedagogical reasoning for including books that are challenged. Containing only literature that is unlikely to be controversial dramatically shortchanges students' ability to develop critical thinking skills and to examine different styles of writing. It also discourages reading by stigmatizing some of the best books ever written.